This is for my book jacket author picture. But my book called Ceramics is going to be this picture.
Let's go.
It's like simultaneous. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about BigQuery. Again here, Alex, Thomas.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Alex.
So should I?
Yes,
Okay.
you take over.
Yeah. So we want maybe to talk a little bit about structuring your SQL queries and so on. What are we doing there? What are our best approaches and so on? Because we talked now a lot about Data Studio, we talked about Google Analytics and so on. And I think the last page on it is BigQuery, I think, also in terms of what is our daily work. We did already one video about the new BigQuery UI, and that was already quite good. And so we can also continue there. So structuring ETL queries or SQL queries. Maybe I can start. So maybe one question is how you, or when you use with and when you use in and outer queries. To be honest, especially at the beginning when you're starting with SQL queries, I think to use with queries is easier as to use inner and outer queries, because then you also have to align it in the correct way, and you it's also not so easy to see where is the outer query, where's the inner query, and so on. But when you see, also it's maybe a little bit more like you programming stuff that you are then going from the top, and then you have the first with query, then you have the result. You can also execute just that result to see the data of that, and then you go every step down, every line, and then you see always the results. I think that's more easy than to use in and outer queries. But then the query gets bigger and bigger when you use a lot of times the with query.
So maybe to go one step back, what you normally have is you have a query, you need to basically aggregate something in a new query. So what you do is put the query you have as a new from inside another query. This is then basically inner query, outer query, what Alex said. The option you have in normally any SQL language is to go with a with query. That means you start with a with, then you have a query, and you name that query as kind of a temporary result. It's at the end, it's nothing more than a temporary in-memory table which is going to be created. And with this namespace, like select something from is then basically a certain like namespace, a certain string. Let's call it temporary table. And in your like real select, you have to select star from your temporary table.
And it works exactly the same as normal other tables and
exactly. So it's completely the same with one like difference. It's not stored somewhere, right? It's just like in memory and used in that query, and as soon as the query is done, this temporary table is also getting removed. The biggest like plus and the biggest difference is that the structuring of your whole query, if it's way longer, is way better than if you like put it with a structure inside inner query, inner query, inner query, inner query, and at the end you lose completely the focus and the overview about where you are at which place. And even if you use the right indentation, there's a point where you're just getting lost. And with the with queries, you have a name for this with query, you have a select from, and then you have a basically comma, and you go with the next with query. The only thing you have to watch is that the sorting is in the right way, because obviously if you have the fifth with query and you referring to another with query, this with query has to be in front. That makes sense. Otherwise you cannot select that. And this is how you can basically go from the beginning till the very bitter end, I would say, because it doesn't matter how many with queries you're using. Important is that you try to use as less as possible, like, how do you say that? inner queries, outer queries, and so on, because you will lose the structure and the focus somewhere.
The only thing what I sometimes realize when I work with inner and outer queries, especially when you are creating or developing your ETL, is inner and outer queries are some cases better to QA or to know what is going on in the query in terms of, for example, you have your first inner query with references to a real table, then you are selecting all of the first select of the innerst one, then you get the data of that, and then you have the next outer query, and then you can also select all of that and then query again, and then you see the changes. Because when you have 3 different widths and you do it exactly like that, so the same structure, but then you, for example, so then you also have to select everything there, and then also the last query or the last result cannot be inside a width, so the last thing has to be outside of the width, the last select form statement, and then you maybe have to delete the width and so on, and rearrange everything, delete the comma and so on, or comment it out. So in terms of getting know what is going on in the different ETL steps is sometimes, at least at the beginning, better, and to also see the changes and the transformations of your data, it's maybe sometimes better to use an inner and outer query. But as you said, it's when you have 3, 4, 5 inner and outer queries inside one width or whatever, inside one query, then it's getting stressing.
What you can do is, or what I usually do is, if you have a lot of with queries, and at the end you have a select star from something, like from final table, something like that, you can go at any point in the middle, remove the comma, go for select star from last table, and then make a semicolon, right? And then just run this selective query. So you have all your with queries, you are in the middle of the with queries, you basically select the last temp table and look what the basically intermediate result is. And this works super good. But on the other side, of course, you're right. And that with the with queries, if you don't select all the with queries from the beginning, your whole structure and your whole process will not work anymore.
Then you can also comment out, for example, when you do some kind of this inner QA ETL or the select statement, then you can also quickly comment out, add the comma again, and then you always have also some kind of QA possibility. One maybe other thing, what I'm also doing now every time is one quick thing you mentioned at the beginning when I started with SQL is this where to. So that's maybe also a cool thing. So in BigQuery, for sure it's important to quickly, for example, comment out when you are just filtering for some rows and so on, and you're doing it with the where clause at the end of the most of the SQL statements. And what we usually do is we type in where, then most of the cases or most of the people maybe already add the first condition. So for example, I don't know, country is Germany, but we mostly doing is where to, then and then country equals Germany. Why are we doing it like that? Because then, for example, you don't want to see the data just from Germany, you want to see the data from all countries. You are quickly just put a hashtag in front of the and the query is still working. Because if you put it the other way, so you say where country equals Germany, then you have to go to the where. So you have to go to the where, then you have to go to with the cursor to the in front of the country dimension, and then you have to put there the hashtag, and that's really cool.
It makes just the whole QA part and process a little bit easier, right? So you have first line basically of your where clause, you have where true, then new line and first condition, new line and second condition, new line and third condition, and whatever you would like for QA reasons to out comment, you just put as you said, hashtag in front of the end, and it's out commented, and the query will always run. Even if you out comment all of your conditions, all of your 3 conditions, there will be then this one single line where true, and this will always be fulfilled.
That's good. Cool.
That's just a small tip. It will not change anything, but it handles the whole QA part and out commenting part a little bit easier.
I also already doing it sometimes for joins, also on to and then and.
Yes.
Also, but that I just doing when I have 3-4 join keys. Else maybe I don't know. But I also sometimes doing it like that. Yeah. For example, one other thing is we also doing the select of the columns. We do not, or at least when we have then the final ETL, we don't have it in one line. We have it always one column in one different line. So every column, yeah, in one different line. Yeah, so also there we can also then quickly comment out columns and so on. If
There's
we don't
one
want it.
exception to that. When I have very, very, very big tables where I have, let's say, I don't know how many columns, really, really a lot of columns, let's say 50 and so on, then I sometimes group them. That means I have then the first maybe columns which are quite important, like ID, name, type, I don't know, I have them on separate lines. But then there are maybe coming all the parts about marketing, for example, UTM source, UTM medium, UTM campaign, and so on. I put them in one line and they have the natural break basically at the end of the line. And I separate them as a group in line and put a comment over them. That means I have ID, name, type, and so on. Then I make one blank. Then I go for a comment, for example, marketing sources, or marketing information. And then I put all the columns with a comma separated in one line, that I have them as a block. That makes the query way more readable compared to I would put them all in one line. If I need to comment one of those things out, it's then I need to do a block comment, of course, because I cannot just put a hashtag in between. But if someone reads the query, they see basically a group of 10 rows or 10 lines for the most important ones. And then there are coming chunks or groups of KPIs or dimensions. And then I usually say, here are the marketing dimensions, here are the something different dimensions, and then they're coming the marketing metrics and so on. And you have those groups with a comment, and it makes the query so much more readable, even if it's like a lot of information inside the select part. Yeah. So think about that. You always need to keep in mind that other people might read the query and also need to understand them. So comment as much as possible. Yeah. Also, if you do complex calculations, there should be a comment attached to that, because otherwise no one will understand why you do that and how you do it.
Yeah. So maybe also relying to that, we always use, or we always put in as the first columns the dimensions, and then at the second section you could say then the metrics you want to group if you have a group. So for example, yeah, so then we always say group by column 1, 2, 3, and then we put sum and averages and so on under it, so that you always have a clear structure of dimensions at the beginning and all of the metrics and KPIs you have then at the end. So maybe also as a quick thing. And what I also maybe quickly want to say is, especially in terms of joins, you should also use aliases. And also, so for every table an alias, that you not have to type in always the complete table, because yeah, maybe it's sometimes a little bit too much. And it's good that the table name is bigger in terms of description and so on. But then use an alias, and always in joins then say from which table the column you want comes. So for example, you have an order table and a customer table, and you want to join them together, that you then say, okay, that column I want comes from the customer table, and that column I reference maybe something like ID. And then you don't know, okay, is it the customer ID or is it the order ID? Could be both. Maybe it doesn't work because also BigQuery then doesn't know what it is. But then when you say, okay, order.id, and then you call it as order ID, and then you have customer.id as customer ID, then it's clear.
Okay, now I know what you mean. That basically you rename the ID to table name underscore ID.
That, but also that you always know with the dot notation from which table it comes, because sometimes when you have, I don't know, so as I said, you have different metrics which is called similarly, then you don't know, okay, for which table it comes. But when you then also, maybe also what I also sometimes doing in the select is first paragraph or first section all the columns I want from the first table, so from the from table. And then in the first join, I also then add maybe a white space or one blank line, and then add the columns from the second table, and so on and so on. And always with the dot notation, that you always know from which table that data comes.
What we sometimes you do that in a natural way, because then BigQuery says ambiguous values if the ID is twice inside.
Mhm.
With your example of the order table and the customer table, you join them via the customer ID. If you have an operational database with tables, and in the order table you have a column ID, and in the customer table you have a column ID, then it's clear. You need to name them and alias them anyway, so otherwise the query will not run. When this is like super important, or when this is the case, is when the order table, for example, has a name ID, and the customer table, it's called customer ID, you will not immediately recognize it, but it could be that at a later point when you work on the query, you are having another table, or you're joining another table, and this has customer ID inside. The problem is, it does not only crash the part you are adding, it can also like affect the part which was working fine before. Because if you don't like put the alias in the right way, it can be that the new table you are joining is completely crashing basically your first part of the query, which was working fine before. That's why train yourself to use the alias from the beginning, even if it's not possible, if it's not needed specifically. And next thing is what I mentioned some seconds ago. Rename your columns from the beginning. That means if in your order table there's a column ID, yeah, go for select star except ID, comma ID as order ID. So then you renamed it from the beginning, and your ID is not named ID anymore, but order underscore ID. So you know very specific what kind of information is in that basically dimensional value. And if you basically watch those two parts, then nothing basically can go wrong, no matter how big your query is getting in the future.
Yeah, maybe one quick thing for this alias. I always, for example, for the metrics, or I want to do, always when I do, for example, sum revenue, so the function sum, the aggregation, then I also set it as sum underscore revenue. And then, for example, if I have average, I don't know, whatever, average sales, then I also call then the alias average sales. But then at the end, you can then also reschedule or rename it again. So in the final table then. But especially when you are creating your ETLs and so on, that you always know, okay, that was the sum of the revenue. Maybe have another value with average revenue and so on, so that you always know what happens in your metrics, in your aggregations, in your groupings, that you know, okay, that is the sum, that's the average and so on.
In the last basically step, I would probably remove the sum,
exactly,
right? Because at the end you have an entity table, you know, okay, one line is one order,
Mhm.
and if there's a revenue attached, you know, okay, that's the revenue of this particular entity. So then the sum would probably then
misunderstood.
be misunderstood. But in the middle of creating, on the way of creating your final result, that's a good tip, because that makes reading the query for anyone way easier.
Yeah.
Way more easy.
Okay, Carlo, I think. Yeah,
Or
do you have
I would say
anything to say about structuring?
Nothing. Nothing to say.
Okay.
Nothing to add. But I think people are interested in these topics, and besides what we write, what we say now, we also write some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Where could they find it?
Yeah, so we have our Medium blog post. I think BigQuery is a little bit underrated in our old blog post, also like in our YouTube. Yet. In our YouTube videos and so on, because it's maybe not so sexy as Data Studio and Google Analytics and so on. But yeah, still worth to say, to talk about it. But you can still check it. We also have LinkedIn, where we also put some new features for BigQuery and so on inside. We have also, maybe I can at least say it one time again, we have our Udemy course about it. SQL course. It's in German, but
It's in German, and I think we made the decision to do it in English already. We can announce that right now that we do the Udemy course in English now. So in the next couple of weeks, then don't know yet when exactly, but we will then continuously publish something.
Exactly.
Pause.
Plus, really important, the newsletter, the new newsletter
New newsletter
every week. So also new data analysis reports and posts and so on. What did I miss? And YouTube, subscribe for sure on our channel.
If you stayed with the video till that point.
Yeah.
Maybe you should have made your announcement beforehand. That would have been good.
Well,
after credit scenes.
Yeah.
After credit scenes.
The announcement is going to be floating at some point.
It could be.
Anyway, thanks everybody for watching the video. Thomas, Alex, and see you next time.
See you. Bye.
See you guys. Bye-bye.